Thank you all for joining us. This is the first, as far as I know, the first public session meeting between the Private Company Council and the AICPA Technical Issues Committee. And so welcome and thank you for participation. The goal of these meetings this time and hopefully every time after this that we meet is to update our constituencies about what we're working on together. They get a chance to hear us interacting with the FASB board, but you're an important part of what we do, and we thank you for being here and thank you for participating. We only have 30 minutes, but we're going to go through at a high level the 5 topics that we reviewed earlier, and everyone who led them pre-prepared their comments in advance of what we talked about over the last couple of hours together. So to the extent that you want to, I want you to pipe in and talk about what you think is relevant on those topics so that, you know, as we talk about the 5, you know, we're giving it's 5 or 6 minutes that we have available. But I think it's important for, you know, the marketplace to recognize we are trying to do well by the private company preparers, practitioners, and users. And again, you're an important part of that for us. And so with that, we'll start with the debrief, and I'm going to turn to Ashley to review leases.
Thanks, Jerry. The first topic that we discussed was leases. And during the closed meeting, PCC and TIC members discussed the PCC's leases research project and the FASB's leases post-implementation review project. On the PCC leases research project, there was a discussion about the recent leases working group meeting, and TIC members provided preliminary views about areas that the PCC leases working group is considering. On the FASB leases PIR project, the discussion focused on feedback received during the public roundtable that took place on September 12th. At this time, I will now pause and ask PCC and TIC members to share their perspectives from the meeting.
Listen, I was giving everyone a chance, their due chance to talk about leases. No, it was a very productive discussion. As a PCC member who serves on the working group, it was encouraging and engaging to be able to talk with our fellow TIC members who serve on the working group, as well as get updates on the post-implementation review efforts that the FASB staff is currently underway with. I felt like it was a very productive discussion on just where we're at as a working group and the things that we've discussed. Leasing is tough. We all acknowledge it is a difficult standard. Private companies have expressed several areas of difficulty to us, and so we are actively strategizing on how we continue to think about opportunities to solve for that. So the areas that we spent a lot of time talking about were modifications, embedded leases, and then potential topics around a single lease model alternative. Without knowing, we don't have a ton of time to go over that. We recognize there's a variety of opportunities within all of those spaces, as well as several challenges that, you know, and hurdles that we would have to overcome when seeking any of those options. So as a PCC closed group, we will be kind of debriefing what we talked about today with the intent to get the working group back together to further explore, I think, the areas of direction we feel really strongly have the greatest possible opportunities to provide simplification for private companies. So I, again, thought the discussion was very engaging, interactive. I think we and TIC are very closely aligned on the direction we're headed. And we're hopeful that, we can ultimately deliver some good simplifications for our private company stakeholders.
Thanks, Doug. As the group talked about some of these things, I think the impact of the single model and what it might be like for sale and leaseback, for classification, on EBITDA calculations, I think those were all raised and I think are going to be a part of what the task force has to, sort of debate and evaluate what we would do going forward. And again, the goal of this is, are there ways for us to appropriately simplify lease accounting for private companies that continues to support, what the user community needs? One of the things we didn't talk about today, but I know is high on the minds of users, is making sure that related party leases probably have the appropriate disclosures and considerations, because that's a place that I know lenders and sureties sometimes struggle with understanding. And so that'll be another topic that I think the task force works on, in the coming weeks and months. And as Doug said, the Private Company Council is going to talk about this in more depth in our public session tomorrow. Doug?
Yeah, you just said something, Jerry, that I think is important to say in this public session, and that as a working group, we are focused on all stakeholder groups. So Jerry, I think you mentioned, right, users and disclosures. So when we talk about areas of simplification for preparers, that is obviously an area of importance for us. But yes, for things like disclosures, particularly those around related parties, we have heard a lot of feedback that there's opportunity, whether that be within 842 or whether that's in the existing related party guidance, to provide some additional clarifications on related party leases. So Jerry, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think it's important for our stakeholder groups to know that we are focused on not just preparer issues, but also user desires as well in these efforts.
Other questions or comments on the leases discussion we've already had? Great. If not, we'll move on to the interest method and determining the effective interest rate, to be led by Chris.
Thanks, Jerry. Today, the staff provided an update on the PCC's research related to the interest method and determining the effective interest rate, and sought feedback from TIC members. TIC members provided feedback on the types of arrangements that can result in significant debt discounts and premiums in practice, their perspectives on whether there should be scope exceptions for a potential private company alternative based on the straight line method, and whether changes should be made to the debt modifications guidance and the guidance on troubled debt restructurings for borrowers to accommodate a potential private company alternative. With that, I'll open it up to the TIC and PCC.
I think on behalf of TIC, that was a great summary, Chris. And again, talking about sometimes in practice, probably the most common area we see this is items with detachable warrants, but sometimes for materiality reasons or things, some of the debt discounts and things are not significant, and therefore people default to using a straight line approach for many things. But I think the key here is, while on the face that seems very simple, is how does that then feed into overall potential modifications to topics such as debt modification, if we're not all starting from kind of a similar definition of interest or interest paid, or where that falls. So thank you.
Any other feedback on the interest discussion? I think as we discussed earlier, we're going to be talking about a bunch of things related to debt. And I think, Kurt in a second is going to lead us through the dialogue we had on debt modifications and extinguishments. But I think clearly this group in the dialogue we had felt like those were somewhat inseparable, or at least commingled relative to what any future changes might be available, and therefore what we might need to pursue or not pursue, as the case might be. Other comments? And I want to make sure that publicly we give Chris and his team credit. Caitlin, I think you were part of it, for writing the 38-page memo on interest expense, which was praised by many. So ironically, I guess is the right word. Thank you.
Well, Jerry, I was looking at Mike to see if he would give the nod, but yes, just to add, for the benefit of this whole group that wasn't here for that discussion, it was a very lively and involved discussion. And I think if I were structuring this agenda, maybe we would have talked about debt modifications and extinguishments first, and then come back to this, because I think we all agreed they are sort of co-tethered. But I think the overarching takeaway is that, yes, we as PCC and TIC agree that there is an opportunity to simplify the interest method, and by potentially providing some layer of straight lining of discounts, premiums, debt issuance costs. We have acknowledged, though, with the help of the FASB staff, there are other things that maybe we hadn't considered from a user relevance perspective. And as that also interties and intertwines with the debt modification guidance, there's opportunity to really consider those things together. So I think we're all encouraged that there's a good path forward there. But I think the memo and the discussion that we had sort of brought to light some considerations that we need to make sure we have as we move forward on that particular topic.
Thank you, Doug. Okay, next topic that we reviewed, debt modifications and extinguishments, and that's going to be led by Kurt from TIC.
Yeah, thank you. So we also talked about, as there's been mentioned, it's really related to the interest method, potential opportunities to continue to look at debt modifications, extinguishments, and TDRs for private companies. It continues to be an area where there's a lot of challenge in for private companies navigating all the different models and understanding which model they might be in and the different requirements. The calculations can get quite involved. And then if you enter into a loan syndication, it just gets magnified by those different lenders. And so really looking for, I think there's still opportunities to look for ways to simplify those, whether it's looking into the TDR guidance or trying to evaluate if potentially there could be a single model to account for, instead of having different ones for modifications and extinguishments, whether we could get to a single model that provides users with the information they need, but makes it easier for preparers and less costly for them to arrive at the correct accounting answer. And so I think we had a lot of good dialogue around that. And I think both TIC and the PCC think that there's areas to continue working on to try to find a simplification in that area.
Mike, any comments?
I mean, I echo everything that was said. I think that debt modification is a very important area, but you know, in my thoughts, I think we had to understand how interest expense is calculated because that impacts how you calculate whether you have a TDR or a debt extinguishment or modification. So I think this is all great discussion, and say it again, paragraph 83 in the FASB staff's memo really opened up my eyes on what I think the discussion point will be and the hurdles that we have to come over or get over in terms of user relevance and whether that matters. Because if we can't do it for the interest expense, can't do it for the TDRs or the debt mods. So that was great discussion.
Thank you. As the TIC might observe, participation is sort of subject to me asking you to play, so be forewarned. Any comments on the modification and extinguishments? And again, I expect over the next few months, the PCC will be talking about this and related issues at some great depth. And thanks to Chris and Caitlin and others on the team who've done a good job of getting us to the point of us knowing we have a lot of questions to answer before we might come up with alternatives. So with that, subjective acceleration clauses, and Ashley.
All right, one more debt topic. We next discussed the PCC's research project on subjective acceleration clauses. The focus on this discussion was on areas of the guidance where debt classification can be affected by subjective acceleration clauses. So that included probability assessment, the intent and ability to refinance short-term debt on a long-term basis, revolving credit agreements, and debt disclosures. So with that, I'll open it up to PCC and TIC members.
Thank you, Jessica.
Figured I'd better just volunteer before I get called on. And I thought we had a good discussion, actually a more intense discussion than I probably would have anticipated. But again, I think it's one of the areas where, you know, once you make a decision to potentially remove a probability assessment, where we would just say, okay, we're not going to classify it as current until there's a trigger. And how do you define that triggering event? If that's notification from the bank that they've demanded payment, if that's the new trigger, and we're thinking through that, then what's the trickle down effect of that discussion, and how do you describe that trigger? Because, you know, obviously, as I know David had pointed out, accountants trying to dabble in what banks do is not always the best. And we shouldn't be doing that. So I think it's, you know, it was a good discussion going back to, yeah, it's a simplification that if we have a lot of in practice where we're not seeing the classification change due to maybe a materiality or, you know, in practice, these aren't really enforced clauses, then does it make sense when something's not enforced that we have an accounting outcome that's not really what's happening in practice? So I thought it was good discussion there. There was a couple of kind of follow-ups that I think we'll have that also discussed disclosures around debt that was more broad-based than just the subjective acceleration clauses, but are there other changes to debt disclosures where from a private company perspective, you know, a lot of times the user is the bank. So is what they're getting now enough? You know, I think we kind of felt that maybe it's enough now, but is that a broader scope once we get through, you know, debt modifications and all of the other possible projects that are moving now? Is there a further look at disclosures for debt in general that we should do? But that's kind of my not so brief summary.
Thank you for that, Jessica. Robert?
I thought this was a lot of fun. These subjective acceleration clauses, in my opinion, are highly valued by lenders. We love them. They're very seldom tested. They're invisible. You really can't tell when there's negotiations going on because they're threatened. So they're invisible and they can be totally confusing. And I'm glad it's come to this table for this group of people to decide how we're going to handle all those things. Because I think it's something that needs to be addressed. But I'm not sure exactly where we wind up with that. But I think it's an interesting trail.
Thank you. Adam Rourke.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the discussion on this topic. I thought the staff did a great job preparing the memo that provided us, and even the extent of the discussion questions caught some folks by surprise, and it made you really realize just how many times these subjective acceleration clause and material adverse change clause provisions show up in the accounting guidance through 470. It's really kind of sprinkled throughout, so it's hard to look at one in isolation. You really have to consider it all. And this is my takeaway, my notes of discussion. There was overall angst about something that's subjective, and then it sounds like often not exactly enforceable, but more often used as a negotiating tactic. So something that is primarily a subjective clause determining the classification of the debt. I felt like that was pretty consistent from the lenders here present and from pretty much across the table. But we had, I don't know, it was enjoyable for me to dive into the details across the topic. But that was a big takeaway. I also really appreciated hearing from the lenders on how the banks use these, which sounded more to me of a launching point for negotiation versus actually enforcing current demand of payment of debt.
Thanks, Adam, for that feedback. Holly?
I think that one of the things that I took away was this was a lot of agreement to be looking into this topic, I think, but as the conversation went on, there are a lot more complexities to this issue than originally from reading the paper, like dealing with lockbox, classified or non-classified balance sheets, and just how the users really look at this. So I think we got our work cut out for us.
Thank you. Well, I guess the point, though, in broadly is that the standards already exist for most of the things we're talking about. So they've been deliberated a bunch, some in the near past and some in the far past. But us continuing to evaluate whether the private company council is in a position, working with the FASB and the FASB staff to get some changes, is harder than it looks. That there's those that say all the standards shouldn't be the same. But as this group knows, as you start looking at them, there's a reason they're the same. And so, again, it was a great dialogue on that topic, and looking forward to us continuing to work through that. Mr. Jones.
Yeah, just curious, and if you didn't, maybe it's something you could give us or the PCC some feedback on in the future. One is the prevalence of classified balance sheets for your client base. The second is on subjective acceleration clauses. Any similarities or differences in how you do the analysis under going concern versus under this provision, if you didn't already talk about that?
On the first one, I think this group largely would say that they're very prevalent. The clauses are very prevalent, and the classified balance sheets move between industries. So real estate typically doesn't, home builders typically doesn't, but most others, I'll say more commercial oriented entities do, would be, so they have these features, and accountants do evaluate where they should be on the balance sheet. But the going concern part, that was not a part of our dialogue, so we'll make sure we include that. Excellent. The last topic that we went through as a group with TIC this morning was embedded derivatives, and Kat's going to walk us through that.
So we explored the challenges private companies face in evaluating embedded derivatives within complex financing arrangements. These include the need to assess multiple contingent features, review extensive legal documentation, and determine fair value, even when features are ultimately immaterial or not required to be bifurcated. The group acknowledged that despite the effort, many features do not meet the criteria for separate accounting, yet still require evaluation and potential remeasurement, which leads to recurring costs. We also discussed potential private company expedients, such as accounting for the entire instrument as a single unit with enhanced disclosures, and raised questions for the PCC about the decision usefulness of bifurcation from a user perspective.
David Finkelstein.
I thought we had a good discussion on the embedded derivatives. We did bring up the fact that they're more common to see nowadays, especially related to younger companies looking for financing, usually where they're kind of forced more into an alternative financing source, either with VCs or PE companies. And usually a lot of those don't necessarily look for an IPO exit. A lot of the agreements tend to lean more towards a subsequent qualified or unqualified financing, where there's variability built into it or a significant discount or premium on the subsequent financing. So I think it's something that we're probably going to continue with our discussions on the PCC, as well as continue on our discussions on the our agenda priorities to see if there's a potential for simplification.
Other feedback? Well, if no other topics, I think we can call this first open session of the TIC and the PCC to close. Thank you all for coming here today for this, and look forward to us meeting in person again next year. Thank you.